the dictatorship of no alternatives and what lies beyond it, in a second context, the context of European socialism. And this context has enormous significance because European social democracy has been, in the recent historical period, the most admired form of social organization, and therefore the default position of the progressives in much of the world. The default position of the progressives in much of the world is institutionally conservative social democracy. Now, what I propose to do in today's class is to begin by asking, what is social democracy? Then, second, what has happened to it, how it has evolved over the last several decades, why it has evolved in this way. Then, how are we to understand its relation to its professed goal, which is the increase of equality in social life. Then what lies beyond the horizon of institutionally conservative social democracy? What are the problems that it is unable to solve or even to address? And then from the standpoint of this view, to look back once again on the nature of social democracy, to be interpreted from the perspective of both its achievements and its failures. And finally, if there's time, to connect this discussion of social democracy with the debate about the nature of the European Union, futures, and its possibilities. Now, first then, what is social democracy? And I want to begin with a proposition that I introduced before, that in the crudest way, by a first approximation, we can think of social democracy as a kind of bargain. A bargain that began to be articulated in the years after the First World War, and then was fully worked out in the years after the Second World War. Under the terms of this bargain, as I'm imagining it, the forces that threaten the established arrangements of production and of power threaten to reorganize both the economy and the state in some radical way, were induced or forced to abandon this challenge. And in return, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the private economy more intensively, to attenuate inequalities generated in the market by resorting to progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, and to stabilize or organize the process of economic growth through the use of fiscal and monetary policy. And that included, of course, all of the instruments of Keynesianism, not as the original doctrine of Keynes, but as its popular and practical form. Now, from this initial conception of what social democracy is, we can advance to a more elaborate account, which is historical in nature. So, and it has to be, it should be, it will be an unsentimental account, not an idealization of social democracy, as its advocates would propose. So on this unsentimental, I want to use this realistic account. Social democracy was constituted first by a series of arrangements that protected insiders to the detriment of outsiders. Now, the most important such distinction between insiders and outsiders regarded labor and the labor markets. The core constituency and the main apparent beneficiary of institutionally conservative social democracy was the relatively privileged part of the labor force in stable employment, especially in the capital-intensive parts of the production system, and therefore, within that, especially in mass production industry. These beneficiaries, these insiders, as I'm calling them, were benefited to the detriment of outsiders, all the other workers who remained in relatively unstable employment in what we sometimes call the secondary part of the labor market, often in much less capital-intensive parts of the production system. The second distinction was the protection of those who were in control of the major corporations, the controlling interests in the corporate entities, to the detriment of all of the outsiders, all of the challengers, the incumbents to the detriment of the challengers in the market for corporate control. So there were all sorts of restrictions on the possibility of takeovers under institutionally conservative social democracy, and a structure of crisscrossing corporate states, which stabilized on the whole and in the long term the position of the corporate insiders to the disadvantage of the outsiders. And the third such distinction between insiders and outsiders regarded the contrast between small business and big business. Historically, in the social democracies, small business was protected against competition by big business in all sorts of ways, including, for example, restraints on hours of operation of enterprises or stores, and restrictions on competition. And this third distinction between insiders and outsiders had to do not with the labor market or the market in corporate control, but with the product markets in which these enterprises operate. So this is the first category of the arrangements that define historically institutionally conservative social democracy. A second set of arrangements goes under the label of social contracts or incomes policies. They were in effect deals orchestrated by government between big business and organized labor. And the point of these deals was to agree between these large organized interests the distribution of the benefits and the detriments of macroeconomic policies. So any macroeconomic policy, any way of organizing the growth path of the economy would distribute advantages and disadvantages to certain parts of society. And the risk that people wanted to avoid was the risk of unresolved distributive conflict, especially unresolved distributive conflict between big business and organized labor. Let's agree on who will benefit and who will lose, or what the specific pattern of benefits and losses will be, because then we can have a consensual growth path which will be less costly to the society as a whole. And now the third set of arrangements that distinguished historical, institutionally conservative social democracy were arrangements that resulted in the maintenance of a high level of social entitlements. A high level of social entitlements that would have some redistributive effects. They would diminish inequality in society, but above all, they would make it possible to sustain a high level of investment and in people and in their capabilities, in their security, in their health, in their education. And you could say, looking from the perspective of today, that this third thing, this high level of social entitlements, in retrospect, turns out to have been the most lasting and significant achievement of historical social democracy. So, despite this, the swings, the political swings between right-leaning and left-leaning governments in Europe, the fact is that no right-wing government in any major European country since the Second World War has ever succeeded in achieving a significant rollback in this high level of social entitlements. And for the most part, with a few exceptions, they haven't even proposed such a rollback. So this is an extraordinarily impressive political achievement that the Social Democrats managed to stabilize against what had been before the Second World War often fierce opposition, this high level of social entitlements. That's the greatest achievement of social democracy. Now, before I go any further, let me ask if there are any comments or questions about these initial propositions. It's really just a description, a characterization of what social democracy has been. Now, yes.
Are there any consequences you think to having an assumed high level of social entitlement, or is it an unqualified
consequences? So there are many consequences. So
negative.
One consequence is you have a population which is much more capable and secure than it would otherwise be, and secure in a haven of vitally protected safeguards and capability assuring endowments. So the development of this haven is really the great conquest, the great achievement of social democracy. And that has, of course, many economic and social consequences. Now, I want to argue, as the argument proceeds, that we have the haven so that we can have around the haven a storm of innovation, of experiment, change, of construction. And that's the part of this idea that social democracy is missing. So, putting it in very simple terms, it's as if historical social democracy were mainly about this haven. Well, where's the part about the storm? The part about the storm is missing. And that too will have many consequences. Yes?
When you were talking about the contrast between small business and big business, you said small business was protected by social democracy.
Protected by the state, yes.
Does that mean that small business was like the insider of social democracy? Is that what you were
No, I would say the main insider, generically, were those who had some tenured claim, and they had the most direct benefit from what I was just calling the haven, generically, right? But they weren't everyone. That's the realistic, anti-sentimental point that I made. That there were insiders and there were outsiders, relatively. The contrast between insider and outsider was less rigidly drawn in some European countries than in others. Less rigidly drawn, for example, in Scandinavian social democracy than in countries like France or Germany, in which traditionally the social benefits, the entitlements, were job-related. So if you didn't have one of those tenured jobs, you didn't have all those benefits. And it was, in that sense, less universalistic, a less universalistic form of social democracy. Now, what in the broadest sense has happened to social democracy in the way in which I just characterized it as this set of arrangements? The basic story is that social democracy has retreated. It has retreated by giving up, little by little, the first two components that I just described, and retreating to the last line of defense, which is the third component. So little by little, it has given up these restraints that protect the insiders to the detriment of the outsiders, especially in the labor markets. And it has abandoned the attempt to orchestrate these incomes policies or social contracts. It's given those up. In a moment, I'm going to say why I think it's given those up. It's given those up in exchange, as it were, for maintaining what, in the end, has seemed to be most important and most defensible, which is the high level of entitlements. That's a short version of what has happened to social democracy over the last half century. Now, why has it given them up? What has happened? Social democracy has been, as it were, liberalized or hollowed out from within. And this liberalized or hollowed out form of social democracy is what we sometimes call social liberalism. And social liberalism becomes the ascendant project, the hegemonic program in a period in which the main program of the elites on both sides of the Atlantic has become to somehow combine, to synthesize European-style social protection with American-style economic flexibility within a barely adjusted version of the inherited and established institutional arrangements. Now, there is an ideological element in the causation of this retreat, and let me address that element first. So, the distinctions between insiders and outsiders that I previously described, and to some extent also by insiders, big business and organized labor, under the watchful eyes of the central government, which was, as it were, the third party to these social contracts. There's been a retreat from these deals of the insiders and from the protections of the insiders. And those arrangements of social contracts and those deals protective of the insiders have been attacked on two grounds. First, on the grounds that they're inefficient. They impose costly rigidities on the economy, on economic growth, which exact a cost in foregone output. And second, because they're unjust, they're unfair. They defend the insiders to the detriment of the outsiders. So there's an argument of flexibility, and there's an argument of fairness, of justice. And they've been combined. in this social liberal ideology. And you could say that ideological position, the position which I just summarized very briefly, has become, in fact, hegemonic in the North Atlantic world. That's the dominant position. The dominant position is to combine the social protection which the Europeans have or had with the economic flexibility of the Americans, so we can have all the advantages of a highly flexible and efficient market economy, but humanize it in some way. So the idea that emerges, the self-congratulatory form of this social liberal ideology, is that this is what we wanted all along. The preservation of the market order, but its humanization. So that's the ideological element, and the power of this ideological element is part of the explanation for this retreat of social democracy. But of course, that's far from being the whole story, because there were real economic transformations. And let's now briefly consider what some of those were that help account for this retreat and this hollowing out of institutional social democracy. So historical social democracy, as I initially described it, with those three components, had a basis in a certain regime of production. And the main element in that basis was conventional industry for this mass production industry. So the core historical constituency of the social democratic parties was the labor movement, the organization of workers in the capital-intensive parts of the economy, above all for this mass production industry, manufacturing. Large-scale production of goods and services by rigid machines and production processes, semi-skilled labor, very hierarchical and specialized relations of production, the technical division of labor. That was the core constituency. And this core constituency has been destroyed. Not all at once, but little by little it has been eroded in Europe and in the United States and all over the world, as I've mentioned in the previous few classes. And in its place has arisen a new productive vanguard, the productive vanguard of the insular knowledge economy, present in every sector of the economy, not just in manufacture, also in services and in agriculture, eliding the distinctions among these sectors, but in every part of the production system, just a fringe, a set of islands, excluding the vast majority of firms and of workers. And now we can add another element to this story, which is the organization of the world economy on a new basis. There is now a global system of tax and labor arbitrage, a search for parts of the world in which businesses can benefit from the lowest possible tax rate and the lowest possible wage. And in these other parts of the world with low wages and low tax takes, then the former Fordist industries, or their successors, then often serve as satellites, as sidekicks to the new vanguard, as I described before. The vanguard discovers a way to bifurcate the process of production into two parts. A creative and highly lucrative part, which it keeps for itself, and then a commoditized or formulaic part that it subcontracts to businesses and workers all around the world. That's what I call the new putting out system. Like the putting out system described by Marx in the early chapters of Capital, the organization of work on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements and on a global scale. And finally, we have to remember that under this world economy, hundreds of millions of especially Chinese and Indian workers have come onto the global labor market, pressuring the returns to labor. So this has put historical social democracy and its protective arrangements under tremendous pressure. And part of the explanation of this hollowing out of social democracy from within lies in the response of the Europeans to these pressures. So that's the story, that's the beginning of the story that one would tell. It combines this element of ideological hegemony, of neoliberalism or liberalized social democracy, this hollowing out from within, with these global pressures, including pressures that come from what is a new global labor market. And so that helps explain what has happened. Now, again, before I go any further, let me stop and ask about, if you have questions, comments about this. Yes?
Yeah, when you mention the economic flexibility of Americans, you're referring to neoliberalism, or it's a previous form of capitalism?
Well, of course, in the United States, in most historical periods, work relations were always quite flexible when compared to other parts of the world, especially when compared to Europe. So in this ideology, because remember, that was the ideological part of the explanation, the United States stands for economic flexibility, whereas the Europeans stand for the idea that certain aspects of the real economic situation of the worker should be excluded from the market and protected. And then the idea is, well, how can this be combined in some way? So take the aspect of labor, we're going to come to this in a moment. There have been in this period two discourses about labor in the world, in the whole world, not just in the North Atlantic region. One discourse is the discourse favored by the traditional representatives of labor, defense of collective bargaining, and the view that any form of precarious employment is a fraudulent evasion of the labor laws, which should basically be suppressed. So that's a discourse that is very much in the interests of the insiders, the protected workers, but it's not clear that it's in the interest of the majority of the workers who don't enjoy these stable jobs. And in many large developing countries, that's the great majority of the labor force. They're in the informal economy, non-registered workers, and they're not the beneficiaries of what is, in effect, to use a Marxist category, a labor aristocracy, this elite of highly organized and relatively protected workers. The other discourse has been the neoliberal discourse of flexibility. And flexibility has become a slogan in the name of which larger and larger parts of the labor force in one country after another are abandoned to precarious employment, to unstable employment. And that includes, for example, self-employment as a disguised form of wage labor, now very common around the world. So So that's the circumstance, and then the idea would be, can there be a third position in which we admit that the labor markets have to be more flexible, but we don't allow flexibility to become the cheapening of labor. So it shouldn't provide a pretext under this third way of thinking for the lowering of the real wage and the destruction of the benefits of work. So, but then we would have to have a different regime. We would have to say, the solution is not to try and reinvent collective bargaining for this world of flexible employment. The solution is to imagine, alongside collective bargaining law, a new labor law, a new law of relations between labor and capital, that addresses the realities of these new arrangements of work, and that preserves the real wage. So if you take seriously the idea that flexibility should not mean cheapening, you could, for example, have a legal principle of the neutrality of the wage in relation to the conditions of employment. You could say, labor performed under conditions of unstable employment, temporary labor contracts, for example, should be remunerated at a level comparable to the similar labor performed under conditions of stable employment. But up to now, there's been no such project in the North Atlantic world. But this is then simply to describe the nature of this problem. Now, at this point, what I want to do is to propose a digression. Addressed to a complicated, immensely important problem in the interpretation of social democracy and its fate. And the digression has to do with how we should think about the relation between institutionally conservative and later liberalized social democracy and equality. And especially the relation of progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements, widely used by social democrats, to the goal of equality. And my digression then takes the form of proposing three principles by which we should understand these problems. So the first principle says, with respect to equality, everything that we can do by way of structural change, shaping the primary distribution of economic and educational advantage, is much more important than anything that we can achieve by compensatory redistribution through progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. So the basis of this first proposition is the distinction between the primary distribution and what I'm calling the secondary or derivative distribution. So the primary distribution is the one that results from the normal operation of the established form of the market economy. And it creates a certain distribution of wealth, income, and opportunity. The secondary or distributive redistribution is the one by which we attempt after the fact, retrospectively, to correct what the market has done. And we do so mainly by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. Now, the claim that's being made in this first proposition is that it's the primary distribution that really matters. The secondary distribution has only a marginal effect. It can attenuate inequalities, but it can't overcome massive inequalities. It can't overcome massive inequalities because to overcome massive inequalities, it too would have to be massive. That is, it would have to cancel out, to annul the inequalities produced by the normal operation of the market. And to do that, it would begin to disturb or derange the established arrangements and incentives of the market economy. So the market does this, then we say, well, now we'll make it do the opposite. That's not what can be achieved, according to this first proposition, by secondary redistribution. It can have a marginal effect on attenuating inequality, and above all, it can do what I said has been the main achievement of historical social democracy: a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, in this haven which institutionally conservative social democracy created. So that's the first proposition. Now, going down the hierarchy, the second proposition is that nevertheless, the budget, the whole system of public taxation and public spending does have an effect on the level of equality and has a legitimate role to play. However, in addressing this second proposition, we have to explain a paradox. And the paradox is that among the rich industrial democracies of the North Atlantic world, the one that on paper has the most progressive tax system on the whole is the United States, which we know is by far the most unequal of the rich industrial democracies. On paper, it has the most progressive tax system because its tax system gives a central role to the progressive taxation of personal income, the progressive income tax. Whereas the European social democracies, which profess a much more egalitarian ideal, base their tax system on the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. Now, how can we explain this paradox? That the most unequal country is the one that appears to tax more progressively, and the most equal countries are the ones that tax regressively. So here is the beginning of such an explanation. Why are the European social, why do the tax systems and the budgetary systems, the systems of taxation and spending of the European countries on the whole have a more egalitarian effect than the American system? The basic answer, I want to argue, is very simple. It has nothing to do with the progressive or regressive profile of the tax system. Is that the Americans take in at least 10% less by way of taxation than the Europeans. The aggregate tax take is at least 10% lower. And then everything that is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget, that is by progressive taxation, is gained in double on the spending side. So the Europeans are then able to spend much more on the health and education and security of their citizens. Now, why? And here then is the other part of the elucidation of this paradox. The mainstay of the European tax systems is the VAT, the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax. Now understand what the VAT is. Conceptually, it is the most neutral possible tax. Because what it does, if you imagine the whole economy as an input-output table, a set of inputs transformed into outputs all along the way, resulting in some aggregation of value. What the VAT does, the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, if it is perfectly neutral and comprehensive, is to take a constant proportion of the transformation of every input into an output. And so by definition, it is a tax that is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices in the economy. And because it is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices in the economy, it least disturbs the established economic incentives to invest, to save, and to employ, and the established economic arrangements. There's the most take with the least economic confusion. So this then allows the tax take to be much higher than it is in the United States. A directly progressive tax disturbs the operation of the economy. So this then would be the beginning of an explanation of that paradoxical feature. Yes?
Why doesn't the US have a VAT?
So this is another part of the discussion. And so what happens in a country like the United States is that the progressive politicians know, or should know, or that that progressive taxation has only a marginal effect on inequality. But they seem to think that if they favor progressive taxation, they are signaling on whose side they are. So in the discourse of politics, the defense of progressive taxation is a way of saying, I'm on the side of the poor, I'm on the side of the workers. This is what they say during the elections, during the political contest. But not necessarily what they do in power. So I think that's a large part of the explanation. Because after all, the claim that I'm making here is paradoxical, right? You're saying, so in the United States, the business interests, the rich, like the idea of a flat tax. But they don't like the idea that the flat tax will be used dramatically to raise the aggregate tax rate. And they don't imagine they would do that. Whereas the progressives like the idea of progressivity and of the raising of the tax rate, but they don't like the idea of basing it all on what is avowedly and explicitly a regressive tax. Because the indirect taxation of consumption is regressive, massively regressive. And all the European countries base their tax system on the regressive taxation of consumption. France doesn't have a VAT, but it has like a functional equivalent to the VAT in a combination of indirect and regressive taxation on consumption that produce much of the same result overall. So it would require great pedagogic clarity and some courage on the part of the politicians to say, this is what we propose to do. Our short-run priority must be to elevate the aggregate tax take, regardless of the short-term progressivity in the profile of the system of taxation. Yes?
Could you elucidate how the VAT least disturbs economic incentives? Like,
Sure.
what economic?
Just conceptually, it's not complicated. Because if the VAT is neutral with respect to relative prices, and it never really is perfectly neutral because it's not perfectly comprehensive in the way I described, but its ideal is to be comprehensive and neutral. So it changes nothing in the system of relative prices. So by that fact alone, it is the tax that least disturbs the established economic incentives and arrangements. Every other tax, every direct tax, intervenes in the system of relative prices. And so it affects the incentives and disturbs the operation of the economy. Yes.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand your answer to my question and building on what you just
Yeah.
asked. So if I understand, the reason that the progressives in the US don't propose the VAT is because, I guess I'm not clear still why they wouldn't. It would produce more tax revenue overall, that would create better redistribution or better.
The reason is very simple. The reason is it's a regressive tax. So it sees to be unjust. That's the reason. It's not a mysterious reason. I mean, it seems to me that the VAT is an explicitly regressive tax. Now, the progressive politician will say, you expect me to explain to the citizens that the way to achieve progressivity overall, of a more progressive redistribution, is to use a regressive instrument. What they'll, and then they'll probably add, the flat tax is going to be appreciated for its regressivity, but not going to be used in effect dramatically to increase the tax take. So that's what the business interests want, and the business press. That's not what any progressive should want. So a progressive politician who took this idea seriously and attempted to explain it to the people would be taking his career into his hands, right? And say, how am I going to, the professors don't understand this, how are ordinary people going to understand it? It's a tall order. Yes.
So I think I don't understand why you claim that the US tax system is progressive on paper. Because even I understand sort of this impact of the direct tax, but even on paper, the US tax system doesn't do more to redistribute before and after tax inequality than other OECD countries, for instance.
Well,
So it's
I'm simply appealing to the fact that the overwhelming source of taxation in the European countries is indirect and regressive. The VAT or some functional equivalent to it. In the United States, they attempt at least a gesture of progressivity. There have been times in the United States when it was really progressive,
Right.
violently, like in the war economy during the Second World War. The top marginal rate of the personal income tax at one point was 92%. That's unimaginable to Americans now, but that happened. And so now it's more modest, the progressivity is more modest, and there's a feature of the income tax which is not as widely appreciated as it should be, which is that the rich on the whole don't pay income tax. They don't pay income tax in any part of the world. The income tax is basically a tax on the salaries of the middle class. That's what it is, in fact. So it appears to be progressive, and in an arithmetical sense it is progressive because it allows for this progressive slope, but it's not a tax paid by rich people. They have millions of ways of escaping it, as you know, so that's the tax that the Americans use. So I'm saying that it appears to be more progressive on its face because it's a progressive tax. But we know that that not only does it result in a much lower aggregate tax take, which is the fatal flaw, but it itself is a tax from which the major holders of assets in the country have no trouble escaping. So that's the reality. Now, why could that reality not be more widely understood? The question. Yes.
Yeah. It's about the regressive tax system. You're saying that the VAT is the most neutral tax system because it provides a flat rate. But isn't it unfair for the people of low income because everyone is paying the same rate of tax?
I'm not disputing that it's progressive. That's what I'm saying. The indirect taxation of consumption is regressive. And it does appear on its face to hurt most the poor, because almost by definition, the poor consume a much larger part of their income than the rich. And that's going to be hit by the VAT. But that doesn't go to the issue of neutrality. The issue of neutrality is also conceptual. It's by definition. It's the conception of a tax which takes a constant part of the transformation of every input into every output. Now that, by definition, is the tax that least disturbs the operation of the market. It is attacked not because there's a failure of neutrality, but because it's seen as unfair for the reason you just stated. Now there's a third proposition, because there are three propositions and it's down the hierarchy. So the third proposition is that once you establish the tax system on this basis of a neutral, indirect, avowedly regressive tax on consumption, it would be relatively easy to add a very progressive element. Now, again, let me generalize first. So, what are, in principle, the two main objects of progressive taxation? There are two of them. One is the hierarchy of standards of living. So some people are able to live in luxury, other people live in poverty. That's one object of progressive taxation. The second object of progressive taxation is the accumulation of economic power. Because of course, if you hit the hierarchy of standards of living, you're not hitting the use of money to generate power, to buy political influence, to lord it over others, to command other people's labor, and so forth. Those are the two great targets of progressive taxation in principle. The income tax is a hybrid tax. It's a confusion which doesn't clearly hit either of these two targets. Now, of these two targets, the one that is relatively easier to hit is the hierarchy of the standards of living. The accumulation of economic power is much harder to hit because, after all, it directly depends on the institutional arrangements of the market economy. So you have to reorganize the economy, have to reorganize, for example, the rules under which you recognize when free labor is really free. So this is the dispute that we're going to have later in the course of whether wage labor should be considered free labor or is a deficient and inferior form of free labor, as almost everyone in the 19th century believed. So the easiest aspect of the accumulation of economic power to hit by a tax instrument is the hereditary transmission of property. And you know, and it came up in an earlier class, that not a long time has gone by since the two then richest men in the United States organized a national campaign and took full-page advertisements in the newspapers to defend the estate tax. And they were defeated because the great majority of the population was antagonistic to any heightening of the estate tax, although they're presumably the beneficiaries of such an initiative. So the hereditary, a radical tax on the hereditary transmission of property would be the easiest fiscal way, the easiest tax instrument to hit the accumulation of economic power, to interrupt it at the moment of death. Now, what about the other target of progressive taxation, which is the hierarchy of standards of living? There is a tax which can be designed directly to hit this first target of direct taxation. It is the individualized tax on consumption, which was theorized most eminently by Keynes's disciple Nicholas Caldor, who wrote a famous work after the Second World War called the expenditure tax. So it can be described very simply. What it says is you take all of the income of an individual, his labor income and his capital income, and you aggregate it. And then you subtract from that quantity what the individual saves and invests. Because if he's saving and investing it, he's not consuming it. It's not becoming part of his hierarchy of standards of living. He's putting it back into the common pool by investing it in the development of the productive apparatus of society. That difference, the difference between total income and invested saving, is what the individual will spend on himself. And that difference you could tax on a radically hierarchical slope. So you could say below a certain level of consumption, the individual pays nothing. He receives from the state. This is what the Americans call the negative income tax. As he begins to ascend the slope, he pays more and more. And one of the advantages of the individualized consumption tax is that the highest level is not 100%. Because in the expenditure tax, you could say beyond a certain level of luxury living, for every dollar that the individual spends on himself, he has to pay 5 to the state. So the highest rate is 500%. The sky's the limit. So there's no technical difficulty in the administration of the individualized expenditure tax any different from the income tax. It's the same thing as the income tax. It's a declaratory tax, just like the income tax, that presents the same risks of evasion or a misrepresentation, but nothing greater than the income tax. And it has a difference that what you don't demonstrate as saved and invested, counts as if it had been consumed. So the individual has an interest in demonstrating what he saved and invested, because it's that difference which will be taxed. Yes?
Isn't that usually most, especially business owners who have stocks, who own stock of their company, they will declare low income, but most of their wealth is actually on equity or equity owned. So they might be negative on consumption in that sense, right? Because your formula is total income.
That has to do with the other target. So remember, this tax would be designed squarely to hit what I'm calling the first target of direct taxation, which is the hierarchy of standards of living. It's not doing anything to tax the accumulation of economic power like equity in firms or anything. It's not touching that. And that, I'm admitting, is much harder to reach through direct taxation. And I'm claiming, what's the best moment to hit that? It's at the moment this person dies. And then you can tax it all away. And you can treat anticipated gifts inter vivos, inter-family gifts, equivalently to the way in which you treat the estate. So if he transmits within the family before dying, you tax him by the same high radical rate. That's the way in which you would hit it. This tax is designed solely to deal with the problem of the hierarchy of standards of living. And what it's saying is, there's no limit. There's no technical difficulty in the administration of this tax, because the limit is political will and political power, nothing more. You're progressive, you say you want a progressive tax, I'll show you a progressive tax. You can make it much more progressive than you imagine possible by this tax. Huh? But that doesn't happen. So these then are the three the three principles. Structure over compensatory redistribution. With respect to compensatory redistribution, taking the revenue-raising side and the spending side of the budgets together as they should be taken together. What counts in the short term is the aggregate rate of the tax take and how it is spent, much more than the progressive profile of taxation. Then we come to the third principle. Now let's introduce the element of progressivity, distinguishing clearly these two targets and avoiding the hybrid, phony method of the income tax, which is a kind of pseudo-progressivity in the whole world. So those are the principles by which we would judge historical social democracy. So if historical social democracy has succeeded in its work of maintaining a high level of social entitlements and investing in people and in their capabilities, it is because in practice it has understood the second of these three principles. So it has not paid any obedience to the first principle because at the outset it abandoned structural change, the most important thing. And it has not done anything for the third principle because it has not radicalized the taxation of inheritance or the other forms of hitting the accumulation of economic power, or created this taxation to hit directly the hierarchy of standards of living. But it has, through the VAT or its equivalents, achieved a much larger tax take than is possible in a system that uses an avowedly progressive tax. And it has used that to finance its investment in people and their capabilities. So that's the mystery, the riddle of social democracy explained right there. It has achieved a high level of social entitlements, paradoxically financed by the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption. Now, the friends of social democracy in Europe and around the world don't say all of that. Now, do they understand it or not understand it, or they think it's too great a mystery to be divulged to the people? Mark Twain said, "The truth is so precious that it should be revealed little by little." And so this is what would be required. Comments? So this is significant. So it's a way of recognizing the achievement of social democracy, but from a distance, judging it by what it's achieved and failed to achieve, and trying to clarify, to demystify this relation of equality or inequality to the fiscal activities of the state. So now we can ask, what lies then beyond the historical horizon of social democracy? Because it has this real achievement. And the achievement has misled people all over the world. So in my country, for example, in Brazil until recently, almost everyone in politics pretended to be some kind of center leftist. And the example to be followed was Scandinavian social democracy. And I said, well, we have dozens of parties. But it's like we had until recently only one real ideology, which I call tropical Sweden. So, and it's this idea that we would obviously very unequal, one of the most unequal societies in the history of the world. Let's become like Sweden. And then and in the United States, the progressive economists, seem to think that the ideal would be for the United States to become the Sweden of 1970, which is when the Social Democrats were in power and all of these arrangements that I described were in effect. Neither the Brazilians nor the Americans understand the reality of this. That is, Sweden was a peasant society that became rich, and for the first part of for many decades in the 20th century, there was a struggle over access to economic and political power between the social democratic state. The social democrats were in power most of the time, and the familial plutocracy, the dynastic plutocracy that owned and continues today to own most of the Swedish economy. And it ended in a kind of truce between the Swedish state and this familial plutocracy, in which part of their power was confiscated, and the state acquired power intensively to intervene in these business enterprises and to influence their corporate governance, but they were allowed to remain the controlling shareholders of their enterprises. Now, the Americans and the Brazilians don't understand that the epilogue which they admire, which is the high level of entitlement, was preceded and made possible by many decades of struggle over the distribution of political and economic power. So they want the brief epilogue of the high social entitlements without the long prologue of the struggle, which was some form of struggle over the institutional arrangements. That was the real thing. And now, under this liberalized social democracy, the question is, does it solve the problems of these societies? And here, the fundamental argument I want to make is we cannot solve or even address any of the basic problems of these contemporary societies within the limits of this social democratic compromise. So we would have to reopen the terms of that bargain that was made before and after the Second World War, and to admit that the arrangements of power and of production would be revised to solve any of these contemporary problems. And we shouldn't think of this transformation that would be necessary as a kind of systemic change. That's the bad old binary idea of politics. Either we have the revolutionary substitution of one indivisible system for another, or we have the reformist management of a system. They're not systems. They are divisible. Structural change, when it happens, is piecemeal and can nevertheless become cumulative. And the character of these radical reforms, of these piecemeal structural changes, is the main object of discussion in this course. So what is it that this liberalized, hollowed out form of social democracy can't do? And what is it that institutionally conservative social democracy already couldn't do in its original form? So first are all the problems that result from the organization of the economy, from the failure to democratize the market order. Of these problems, the most important is the hierarchical segmentation of the production system and its division between vanguards and rearguards, between the advanced form of production and everything else in the economy. And the characteristic form that takes today is the emergence of this insular knowledge economy that I described previously. excluding the vast preponderance of workers and officials. So then we have a form of inequality which no compensatory redistribution could suffice to overcome, because it's massive. And the compensatory redistribution would have to be correspondingly massive. And long before it reached the requisite dimension, it would begin to derange the established economic incentives and arrangements. Then second, there's the relation between labor and capital. So now the emergency problem is the problem of precarious labor, in which an increasing, now a preponderant form of the labor force in all of these economies is not in stable employment. It is under various conditions of unstable, precarious, and sometimes, frankly, temporary employment. And then we have that dilemma that I described before. So there's the traditional labor discourse, organized around collective bargaining, which attends to the interests of the organized minority of workers, to the detriment of the interests of the organized majority. And then there's the neoliberal discourse, which under the slogan of flexibility justifies the abandonment of labor to radical economic insecurity. So we would have to have a third project of protecting, lifting up this precarious labor without pretending that by decree we could prohibit these new relations of production, simply declaring that they're illegal. And then the third problem is the problem of the relation of finance to the real economy. So all of these economies have become financialized. In all of them there is financial hypertrophy rather than financial deepening. The system of finance, rather than being enlisted in the productive agenda of society, uses the transactions of the real economy to serve itself. And we might think, as the beginning of a programmatic argument, that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful, to make it serve the productive agenda of society, to prohibit the forms of financial speculation that are merely predatory and have no colorable relation to the expansion of output or the rise of productivity, and to multiply the channels between the dormant productive potential of the saving of society in the banks and the stock markets and the productive agenda of society. There's an enigma. Under the present arrangements in all the market economies in the world, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Well over 80%, according to some calculations, well over 90% of the finance of production is internally generated in the production system itself. Well, then you can ask a simple question. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Supposedly designed to serve this productive agenda. In fact, sterile. So that's the question that's raised by the second problem. And then a change in the relations of finance and the real economy would be the prelude to a series of other changes in the legal and institutional architecture of the market order. The analytical premise is the one with which I began the course. The market order in every domain has no single natural and necessary form. It is a construction, and therefore we can reconstruct it. And then And then we come to, so let's say that all has to do with the creation of socially inclusive economic growth through the reorganization of the market order. The second set of problems that cannot be solved under the present arrangements, the arrangements of this liberalized, hollowed out social democracy, is the basis of social cohesion. And here the problem in Europe is very clear. So, under social democracy, the basis of social cohesion is the orchestration by the state of money transfers. That's the characteristic activity of the social democratic state. To take money from one pot and give it over to the people who are indeed investing in their capabilities. Against the background of a high level of ethnic, cultural, social, religious homogeneity, because the European nations, until recently, were like little tribes, families of families with this high homogeneity. Now there's this increased pluralism, migratory flows in the European Union. The background of homogeneity is eroded. And the erosion of the background of homogeneity makes patent the weakness of money as a social cement. Money is not an adequate social cement unless it is taking place against the background of this high level of tribal homogeneity. If there isn't this homogeneity, if there is heterogeneity, there isn't the adequate basis of social cohesion. From what then does social cohesion arise? It arises from the multiplication of forms of collective action. People from different origins, from different classes, from different parts of society and of culture, doing things together. That's how social cohesion is produced. And a simple direct form is service. Military service, social service, mandatory, voluntary. That's the basis of social cohesion. This activity of purpose-driven collaboration, cooperation in social life. And now comes a third problem that lies beyond the horizon of social democracy. The third problem is the organization of change. All of the European societies in the 20th century depended on war to change. They changed when there was war. And Europe was the seat of the two greatest wars in human history, the First and the Second World War. And it was these shocks of war that drove transformation. So we need a form of a high energy democracy that renders the impulse to change endogenous and weakens the dependence of change on crisis. And that then was the beginning of our discussion of high energy democracy. Elevating the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in political life, resolving impasse quickly, that is, hastening the pace of politics, and combining strong central initiative with radical devolution. So society goes down a certain road. As it goes down that road, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself to diverge from the predominant solutions and to generate counter models in the now. And then we don't need war because we've created the provocation for transformation has become internal to the organization of political life. Yes.
I'm curious about the relationship between the second problem, like this first set of problems around socially inclusive economic growth, and then the problem of social cohesion, and whether addressing the problem of social cohesion would mean bringing more a greater proportion of people's lives outside of the market
Well,
economy,
so it's
or whether
related in many ways. And one of the ways in which it's related is something that I've signaled early in the discussion, we'll come back to in much greater detail. These new forms of production, like a more inclusive knowledge economy, require a heightening of the level of discretionary initiative and the reciprocal trust allowed and required of all participants in the process of production. And we already see that today, even in the insular and somewhat perverse form of the knowledge economy that we have. These are the practices of cooperative competition among firms, and then within firms, this cooperative way of organizing work, the flattening of hierarchies, and the fluid mixture of cooperation and competition. So a market order is then created, which rather than being based as the traditional market order and Fordist mass production was, on the generalization among strangers of a low level of trust, is now based on a relatively higher level of trust. And the background to that higher level of trust is social capital, association. So that is likely to flourish in a society in which people are doing many things together. And they are accustomed to this purpose-driven collaborative activity. That's the basic economic connection, in which social capital, the associational density of society, becomes a sociological premise of economic empowerment. That signals the direction. Huh? And you could generalize the point outside the production system, outside the market, and say, only an organized society is capable of generating alternatives and acting on them. The organization is power, and a disorganized society is a disempowered society. So take another example of this, which is directly relevant to the central political topics debated in the politics of the European countries. So they debate the quality of public services, because overall, this high level of investment in people and capability depends on the provision of high quality public services. Now, high quality public services, I believe, require in the future the engagement of civil society in partnership with the state in the provision of these services. So what we have in the world by way of provision of public services is what you could call an administrative Fordism. So industrial Fordism is what I described, this large-scale production of standardized goods and services by these rigid machines and production processes. Administrative Fordism is the provision of standardized, low-quality public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. Now, in what sense do I say that they're low quality? They're low quality in the simple sense that they're likely to be of lower quality than the comparable services that could be bought on the market by someone who has money. That's what it means. And under these alternatives that we have inherited, the only alternative to administrative Fordism as a way of delivering public services seems to be the privatization of these services to profit-driven firms, which then has all the problems that we know. But there's a third alternative, which is likely to become increasingly important in the course of the 21st century. And the third alternative is that the state, let me go back a step and say first, the state under this third alternative would continue to provide a floor of a universal floor of minimum public services to everyone. And the state would, in addition to operating at the floor, the state would also operate at the ceiling in helping to finance and develop the most costly and complex public services. But in the broad middle range between the floor and the ceiling, the state would partner with independent civil society for the provision of public services. So, and that's an example now of social capital outside the market, because we're talking about the provision of public service. The state would help organize civil society, would help train it, equip it, monitor it, so that it would be capable through non-profit-oriented cooperatives of health workers, of education workers, partnering with the state in the competitive and decentralized pluralistic provision of public services. Experimentalism based on the self-organization of civil society outside the market and outside the state is the most promising way to enhance the quality of public services. We're not going to enhance the quality of public services if we have only a centralized bureaucratic apparatus being judged from a distance by the citizens. The best way is for civil society to organize itself, to participate in the creation of its own future, which is the production of people with these capabilities. And how does it do that? It does that through finding experimental ways to provide public services, new ways of providing health services, education services, and so forth. That's not the market, because I'm saying it's not for profit, but it's not the bureaucratic allocation of services by the central state apparatus. So that's another example of the way in which social capital or social cohesion then becomes empowering. But it always proceeds through the mediation of a new set of institutional arrangements. In this case, arrangements that govern the partnership of civil society outside the state and the market with the state in the provision of public services. So that's just to describe, as it were, the agenda. We're not entering into the details now. I'm simply pointing to something that will occupy us in our future discussion. Yes.
Is it possible to make the system endogenous without the support of the state?
Make a system of what?
Make the system endogenous. You were saying the challenge is to make it endogenous without.
Well, the reference to endogeneity came in relation to this question of the relation between crisis and change, right? That was the context in which I mentioned it. I said, we want the impulse to change not to depend solely on these exogenous shocks. In modern history, the two main forms of shock have been economic collapse, like the Depression of the 1930s, and then war, real war, not just these sort of punitive expeditions that the major powers now have, but world war, like the Second World War. Now, the contemporary societies don't have crises yet of the dimension of the crises of the 20th century. So this is, in a way, a problem for them, because this is what they depended on to change. Otherwise, they become fossilized. So political life, I'm arguing, must be organized so that it renders this impulse to change less dependent on the exogenous shocks. That was the context. And then we don't have to wait for the meteor to visit us, right? We don't have to see Halley's Comet presaging Napoleon's invasion. We say it will come from within. If our lives happen to have fallen in this interlude between the visitations of the comet, all is not lost. We can evoke transformation from within. That's the argument of a high energy democracy. Yes?
Could you elaborate more? You said there were like 3 big divides that sort of prevent us from.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry, you said there were 3 big divides within the economy, sort of preventing.
3 families of problems that lie beyond the horizon of history. historical social democracy.
Exactly. And the third one was sort of this detachment between finance and real economy.
No, I think you're mixing two things.
Okay.
So, the first set of problems has to do with the transformation of the economic order, the creation of socially inclusive growth. I then singled out in that 3 problems, which were the relation between vanguards and rearguards, the relation of labor to capital, and the relation of finance to production.
So the 2 first ones, for me, it's more easy to understand why they're like a very important part of what's going on. And the third one, which I both feel is a bit more modern, like a bit more has happened like only recently. Could you explain more why that's such a big issue? The detachment of finance.
It's a big
and
issue
real economy.
because the economic surplus, the surplus of recurrent consumption, which after all in the history of economics is supposed to be the major constraint on economic growth, lies sterile for most of its use. And so there's this huge system of finance, and what is it for? Supposedly it's to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, as I just suggested, the productive agenda of society is largely financed from within the production system on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. So what's the point of all of that money in the banks and in the stock markets? That's the beginning of this debate. And this is not just about money. This is also about people. So let's take where we are. So in Harvard University, something like half of the graduating class of Harvard College, despite the financial crisis of 2008, continues to go into some kind of financial organization or management consulting. So this is the talent of the society, of the country, all being absorbed into this financial monster, this hypertrophy. What are they going to be inventing something or making something, or are they pushing paper? So it's about the squandering of these lives. It's not just about the use of capital. It has enormous significance. Okay, so there's one final set of remarks I'll make, and then we'll still have time for general discussion. The European Union, because now there's a relation between social democracy and the European Union, a very direct relation. The European Union had 2 historical presuppositions. The first was it was supposed to be to put an end to the century of perpetual wars in Europe and to provide the conditions for perpetual peace. And the second presupposition is it was supposed to be the space for a form of economic and social organization different from the form of the United States. And that form was supposed to be social democracy and later social liberty. Now, there's a disquieting fact. I'm going to exaggerate now with a caricature, but to explain what the problem is. So, you could generalize and say the tendency in Europe now is that everyone who is very young or very old or romantic or restless or ideological or has great hopes for humanity is against the European Union. So, to generalize the point, the more life you have inside of you, the more blood, the more you're against the European Union. And the European Union lies in the dead grip of the centrist technocrats and the center-left and center-right parties the progeny of Jacques Delors and his contemporaries, the after history people, right? So it's a disaster because then everyone who wants something new and important and vital is against it, and all the people who are half dead already are in favor of it. So this seems to be a dominant project, but looking at it from afar, I would say there's a sense in which it's already dead. Why has this happened? So then we have to look to the way in which the principles that have governed the evolution of the union. So the union has evolved according to the following principle, that the power to establish the basic economic and social arrangements of the union are incredibly centralized in the name of harmonization. Centralized de jure in Brussels, de facto in Berlin, and then the power to define the social and economic endowments of the citizens, the social and educational endowments of the citizens, is devolved to the national or subnational authorities. Now, what you could say is that if there's a situation that I've described in which the priority is now to go beyond the hollowed out liberalized social democracy to something else, it should be just the opposite. That is, the relation between these two principles should be reversed. You would say, the main vocation of the union is to assure the endowments and capabilities of all of its citizens, so that the different member states can then experiment in different directions and find a way in which they can then, after the fact, reconcile their experiment. They should have the greatest latitude for experimental divergence, including divergence in the forms of organization of a market economy. That's what we should desire. And for whom would this be especially important? It would be especially important for the East European countries and for the South European countries, for the least rich or the least developed, who have to create new comparative advantage, innovate, change their position, not just within Europe, but within the world. It's for them that it would be important. So they would have to ally themselves with the oppositional forces within Germany and within France to force a change in the direction of the Union. But the impulse to create such a change, to force such a change, has to come from an idea. And the idea is this idea of the inadequacy of the historical liberalized social democracy as the instrument for further advance. So that's what I wanted to say about the European Union. And that completes my argument about European social democracy. Now we still have time for discussion. So what do you think? So I think this chastening of social skepticism, which I have convinced, is of course directly against the position of the tropical Sweden idea, or the idea of the American progressives, let's make the United States like Sweden in 1970. The idea that social democracy had this great achievement, but it cannot address or resolve any of the fundamental problems of these contemporary societies. So given the influence of theories like Marxism, the implication is, what are you asking for? Are you asking for revolution, for the systemic substitution? So you see how it is that the idea of revolution has been converted into an alibi for its opposite. This is what has happened in the history of the thinking of the progressives. They say, real change would be this revolutionary substitution. We then capitalism, so they imagine it's a system. Of course, it's not a system. So the whole concept of capitalism is a confused and contested conception. But that's not possible. It's not in the cards. Or if it were possible, it would be too dangerous, as the calamities of the 20th century show. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world, to take care of our garden. And there you have the humanization of the inevitable, which then leads the majority, all the Europeans who are most alive, to be most against the European Union. And this is the calamity then that results. That's my account. Now, of course, no one is speaking up to defend historical social democracy here in this room. Or the European Union in its conventional form. And I know that this is not a real account of the situation in the world. So it's not as if we had all agreed to turn to what comes next. So this is a deficiency in our situation. What do you think? Yes.
I'm wondering if you could speak more about American progressivism and how it looks at, as you say, like the Sweden of
Europe.
1970. Yeah. So like, how is American progressivism trying to emulate Europe in a way that you have that you're trying to get away from?
Well, so
Like, basically, how do American progressives? What is the American progressive fantasy? Basically,
I think it's unfair to give names, but if you take any of these, take the economists, Joseph Stiglitz, take the politicians like Bernie Sanders. What did they propose? They proposed a system of entitlements. And so, why aren't we like Canada? Why aren't we like Sweden? That's their idea. So they represent the social democratic idea, which is this idea of the humanization. And I can understand why that might be considered progress. But I return to a claim that I made in the very first class. In political struggle, the force that commands the agenda is always the force that most credibly embodies the cause of energy, of dynamism, creation, construction. And then that force leaves to its political enemies the task of putting a human face on its accomplishment. So this then results in the characteristic, somewhat pathetic state of the progressives in many parts of the world. Who are they? They're the ones who execute the project of their political adversary with a humanizing discount. They take the project of their political adversaries, they implement it, and then they sugarcoat it. Now, I'd say that's a losing position in politics. So then it's the other person who demands the agenda. And you just qualify, you hedge in this agenda. That's the essence of the accusation that I'm making. It's not very complicated. So a much more powerful position is to say, we want to embody this cause of construction, of innovation, of creativity, of novelty, and give it a new form. Not just for the sake of more inclusion, more equality, but for the sake of more novelty, more energy, more creation. That's the strong position. And that's then points to a different kind of progressivism. Now, I think in the United States there's a special problem because the two major political parties in the United States are, at the top they're occupied by elites. The base of both is the workers, working class. In the case of the Democrats, they are the uncredentialed parts of the working class, the credential parts of the working class, and the uncredentialed for the Republicans. And they then, at the top, there are these projects of, in effect, state subsidies to the interests of capital. The spending projects of the recent presidents. And so there's no idea that of the productive potential of the ordinary man and woman could be lifted up. And so that then leads to this feeling of dispossession in the United States. For 50 years in the United States, the conservatives won and exercised power by combining concessions to the material interests of the moneyed classes with moral concessions to the religious sensibilities of the moneyless classes. That was the basis of power. And because the progressives didn't represent a different idea of the potential of production, of empowerment in the United States. But this rather weak sugarcoating humanization idea. So the progressives then appear as the humanizers of the inevitable. That's not what they can represent. If they're going to be, they stand a chance of winning in this political contest. They have to represent a different idea of the future that gives primary weight to the forces of creation, of innovation. And how could that not be the case, especially in the United States? If people in the United States don't believe in the future, in the possible, they don't believe in anything. That was the whole basis of American culture. Yes.
I think it's interesting that it's like replicating the inside-outside dynamics that from the readings, like originally from the struggle from the socialist parties, but from your account in the United States, it's just replicating the same inside-out dynamics within the bipartisan system. Mm-hmm. So I thought it's interesting. Just this remark.
Yes.
So when I think of the political desiderata that progressives care about, I don't normally think of creation, energy, and dynamism as being among them, at least not as an end in itself. I'm still hoping that.
No, but this is the difference. Let me comment on that, because remember in the reconstruction that I proposed in the first class of thinking of how to think about the division between right and left. So one question is, so with respect to the goal, the question is, do we become bigger together or apart? And is it natural for human life to be small? So underlying this whole critique of social democracy is the claim that it's not natural for human life to be small. And the struggle against inequality is accessory to this larger struggle against belittlement. Then the division between right and left also has to do with the institutional horizon. Do we imagine that we have to pursue our aims within the horizon of the established organization of society? Or can we transgress these frontiers? Can we cross these frontiers? That's the second difference. So long as we don't imagine the alternative as a system, replacing this other system. So I'm claiming that this is much closer to how the progressives thought of themselves in the 19th century. They did think of themselves this way. And that this way of thinking of themselves as the humanizers, as the sugar coaters, which now seems to be natural, is in fact an invention of the late 20th century.
Right, but I think I want a clearer grip on, well, what belittlement is, or, for transcending sort of like the current institutions, where it is we're going.
Yeah.
One idea that I had while you were speaking about this is that this size here is in part about political autonomy, that's something that social democracy can't really address, and that we need people to become more involved in politics in a way.
So an
And
important
that's important
element,
because of perhaps dignitary effects, or just the value of political autonomy in itself. But again, I'm just hoping to get clear on what it is that we care about, what it is that we're after, besides, equality and the sort of like economic resources that people have access to.
I think that there is an interplay between our understanding of the process, of the method, which is that second part of the contrast between right and left, and the first thing, which is the goal, the normative direction. Now, in the normative direction, I think a central element is the idea of empowerment, of agency, which has many dimensions, takes many forms, the enhancement of agency. So the ability of the ordinary man and woman to stand up and engage his context or her context is a central element. And then the question is, do we do this together in some form collectively? Or do we do it, is there an elite of people who are empowered and agents in this way, standing over the mass of conformists, which is the idea of the right? But I don't want to proceed by these systematic abstractions in this course. I want to proceed by successive levels.